The radar screen flickered in the pre-dawn darkness of Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, and Senior Airman Marcus Webb felt his coffee go cold in his hand. The blip shouldn't exist. It was moving at 180 knots, altitude dropping, squawking an emergency transponder code that hadn't been active in the system for 3 years. 3 years to the day, actually. Webb leaned forward, his chair creaking in the silence of the tower, and keyed his headset with fingers that had started to tremble. The identifier blinked again. Tail number 810964. Call sign, Corvid 1. His supervisor, Master Sergeant A-10, moved behind him like a shadow, her breath catching audibly when she saw the screen. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her hand was already reaching for the red phone that connected directly to the operations center. Impossible because Corvid 1 had been declared lost over the Helmand province in 2022, swallowed by a sandstorm during a close air support mission that went catastrophically wrong. Impossible because the pilot, Captain Nadia Kasparov, had been declared killed in action after 4 days of fruitless search and rescue operations. Impossible because the aircraft itself had been stripped from active inventory, its service record sealed, and its loss attributed to controlled flight into terrain during zero visibility conditions. Yet here it was, transmitting, descending, approaching from the northwest corridor exactly as it would have done returning from a mission over Helmand. Webb's voice cracked when he transmitted. "Unidentified aircraft squawking emergency on approach vector 270. Identify yourself." Static. Then more static, layered with a sound like wind screaming through torn metal. Then a voice, hoarse and thin, barely human. "Bagram Tower, this is Corvid 1 declaring emergency. Request priority handling and emergency equipment on the runway." A-10 had gone pale. Webb saw his own shock reflected in her face. The voice was female, exhausted beyond measure, but unmistakably alive. "Corvid 1, say souls on board and nature of emergency." The response took longer this time, as if each word required tremendous effort. "One soul. Aircraft has sustained catastrophic structural damage. Port wing is 70% separated. Hydraulics failing. I have minimal control authority, and I'm not sure I can land this thing without cartwheeling." In the operations center 300 yards away, Brigadier General Marcus Harrow was being woken by an aide whose face had gone white as chalk. The general listened to the report, sitting up in his bunk, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd signed Kasparov's death certificate himself. He'd written the letter to her parents, chosen the words carefully, attended the memorial service at Dover Air Force Base when her empty coffin came home. Now Webb was watching his scope as the impossible blip descended through 8,000 feet, and he could see on the backup display that its radar signature was wrong, asymmetrical, like a bird trying to fly with a broken wing. A-10 had pulled up the tower's external camera feed, zooming toward the northwest sky where the first gray light of dawn was starting to bleed through the darkness. For a moment there was nothing. Then she saw it, and her hand flew to her mouth. The A-10 Thunderbolt II emerged from the darkness like a ghost ship, and even from 5 miles away, even through the grainy camera, they could see that something was terribly wrong with its silhouette. The port wing was hanging at an unnatural angle, connected to the fuselage by what looked like strips of metal and prayer. The aircraft was yawing heavily, its nose swinging left and right as the pilot fought to maintain directional control with a tail that was partially blown away. Black scoring covered the fuselage, and panels were missing from the engine cowlings. It looked like something that had crawled out of hell itself, still burning. "Jesus Christ," A-10 breathed. Webb was already hitting the emergency klaxon, and across the airfield red lights began spinning as crash crews scrambled to their vehicles. In the operations center, General Harrow was pulling on his uniform with hands that shook despite 30 years of military discipline. Kasparov had been one of his pilots. He'd known her since she was a lieutenant fresh out of flight school, cocky and brilliant, and too willing to push the aircraft beyond what the manual said was safe. He'd chewed her out more than once for hot dogging during training missions. He'd also watched her save a pinned-down Marine unit in Sangin by making gun runs so low that she'd come back with tree branches embedded in her landing gear. When she'd gone down, he'd personally led the investigation. The conclusion had been unavoidable. Zero visibility, spatial disorientation, catastrophic impact with terrain. No survival possible. Her parents had received the folded flag. Her name had been added to the memorial wall. The Air Force had moved on because the Air Force always moved on. Except now she was back, flying a corpse of an aircraft that had no business staying airborne, and Harrow was running toward the tower because he needed to see this with his own eyes. Webb's voice was steadier now, training taking over where shock had paralyzed him. Corvid 1, we have emergency equipment positioning. Winds are 270 at 8 knots. Runway 21 is cleared for emergency landing. Say fuel state and intentions. The response crackled through static thick enough to chew. Fuel state is, I don't know. Gauges are gone. Intentions are to put this airplane on the ground before it decides to quit on me. I've been holding her together for 300 miles and she's tired. 300 miles. The math didn't work. Helmand to Bagram was less than 200 miles in a straight line. Webb felt the question forming, but Akoi shook her head sharply. Not now. Questions could wait. Now was about bringing her home. On the camera feed, the A-10 was established on final approach. Barely. Its damaged wing creating so much asymmetric drag that the pilot had to hold a constant bank angle just to track the center line. The nose was pointing 15 degrees right of the runway heading, the aircraft crabbing sideways through the air in a maneuver that would have failed any student pilot. But Kasparov wasn't a student. She was a combat veteran with over 800 hours in the A-10, and she was flying this half-destroyed aircraft with a precision that defied physics and common sense. The right main gear touched first, chirping against concrete, and for a moment it seemed like she might pull it off. Then the damaged left wing dipped, its tip scraping the runway in a shower of sparks, and the aircraft began to yaw violently left. Kasparov must have mashed the right rudder to the floor because the nose swung back, but the oscillation was building, each swing wider than the last. The nose gear slammed down and the entire aircraft shuddered, pieces of metal sheeting flying off like scales from a dying dragon. She was decelerating but not fast enough, the end of the runway approaching at terrible speed. Then, with what must have been the last of her hydraulic pressure, she deployed the drag chute, and the A-10 groaned as the sudden deceleration stressed a fuselage that was already held together by miracle and willpower. The aircraft stopped 700 feet from the end of the runway, tilted at an angle with the port wing nearly touching the ground, smoke rising from the engines and the landing gear, and a dozen places where metal had abraded against concrete. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The crash crews were rolling toward the aircraft, foam trucks and ambulances converging from multiple directions. In the tower, Webb and Akoi stood frozen, watching. Then the canopy opened, manual release because the electrical system had finally given up, and a figure climbed out onto the wing. Even from a distance, even through the camera, they could see her moving like someone who'd forgotten what it meant to be anywhere but in that cockpit. She reached the ground, took 3 steps, and collapsed to her knees on the concrete. The first crash crew reached her within seconds, but she waved them back, needing a moment to remember what Earth felt like, what stillness meant after 3 years of something nobody would believe. General Harrow arrived at the flight line as they were helping her into the ambulance, and he saw her face for the first time. She'd aged a decade. Her flight suit was stained and patched with materials that weren't military issue. Her hair, once kept in a regulation bun, was cropped short and unevenly as if cut with a knife, but her eyes were still sharp, still alert, still scanning for threats even as the medics checked her vitals. "Captain Kasparov," Harrow said, and his voice broke despite his best efforts. She looked up at him and something like a smile ghosted across her cracked lips. "Sir," she croaked, "requesting permission to be late for my debrief." He wanted to laugh. He wanted to cry. He wanted to know how this was possible. Instead he said, "Permission granted, Captain. Welcome home." She nodded once, Then her eyes rolled back and she sagged against the medics who'd been waiting for this moment. Behind them, the A-10 sat on the runway like a monument to impossible things, and Harrow stared at it while the sun finally cleared the mountains and painted everything in shades of gold and red. By the time Kasparov woke in the base hospital, the story had already begun to spread through Bagram like wildfire. The maintenance crew that had inspected the aircraft were telling anyone who would listen that it was impossible, that the A-10 couldn't fly with that much damage, that the hydraulic lines were severed, and the control cables were frayed down to single strands, and the port wing was held on by less than 30% of its original attachment points. The crash analysis team was taking photographs and measurements, their clipboards filling with data that made no engineering sense. In the hospital, Kasparov opened her eyes to find a nurse adjusting her IV and General Harrow sitting in a chair by the window, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How long was I out?" she asked, her throat raw. 14 hours, Harrow said. "You were severely dehydrated and malnourished. The doctors say you've lost about 30 pounds since your last physical. You have healed fractures in your left arm and 3 ribs. You have scarring consistent with burn injuries on your back and shoulders. And you have a story that I'm told I need to hear before anyone else does." She closed her eyes briefly, marshaling strength. "How much do you know? I know you took off from FOB Rhino 3 years ago to provide close air support for a Marine reconnaissance unit that was pinned down. I know you flew into a sandstorm against direct orders to turn back. I know we lost contact at 16:43 hours and never re-established it. I know the search and rescue teams found nothing but sand for 4 days before we had to call it off." He paused. "I know we buried an empty coffin and I gave your mother a folded flag. What I don't know is how you're sitting here breathing." Kasparov opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. "The storm was worse than forecast. Visibility went to 0 and I lost my attitude indicator. I tried to climb above it, but I was already too low. I hit something, never saw what. The aircraft rolled inverted and I was maybe 200 feet off the deck." Harrow felt his chest tighten. Every pilot's nightmare. Spatial disorientation in IMC conditions with no visual reference and the ground coming up fast. "I got it upright through pure luck," Kasparov continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd lost my GPS, my radios were fried, and my heading indicator was spinning like a roulette wheel. I was flying on whiskey compass and airspeed and whatever prayers I could remember from childhood. I flew until the storm cleared, which took about 40 minutes, and when I could finally see again, I had no idea where I was." She paused, her jaw working as if the next words were physically difficult to form. "The terrain looked wrong. The landmarks didn't match anything from the charts. I thought maybe I'd been blown further north than I realized into the Hindu Kush. I was looking for a road, anything I could follow back to civilization when the fuel warning light came on. The impact must have damaged a fuel line. I had maybe 20 minutes of flight time left." Harrow leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Where did you land?" "That's the complicated part, sir." She turned her head to look at him directly. "I need you to hear this all the way through before you decide I've lost my mind. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly, and she took a breath that seemed to hurt. "I found a valley. It looked promising, flat enough to land on, wide enough that I thought I could maybe get the aircraft down without cartwheeling. I set up for a dead-stick landing, gear down, trying to bleed off speed. I almost made it. The nose gear collapsed on touchdown and the aircraft skidded about 400 yards before it stopped. I hit my head on the canopy frame despite the harness. When I came to, it was dark." She closed her eyes again and Harrow saw her hands clench on the hospital sheets. "I got out. I activated my personal locator beacon and broke out my survival kit. Standard procedure: stay with the aircraft, wait for rescue. But sir, there was something wrong with that valley. The stars were wrong. The air smelled wrong. The silence was too perfect, like being in a soundproofed room. And in the morning, when the sun came up, I realized I wasn't in Afghanistan anymore." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Harrow felt his mouth go dry. "Kasparov," he began carefully, "you've been through a traumatic experience. The doctors said I'm dehydrated and underfed but neurologically sound," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I know how this sounds, General. I know what you're thinking. Hypoxia, head injury, stress-induced psychosis. I thought the same things for the first 6 months, but I was there for 3 years, sir. 3 years in a place that wasn't on any map, where the physics worked just slightly wrong, where day and night didn't match what my watch said they should, where I was being hunted by things that— She stopped abruptly, seeing his expression. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, emotionless, as if reciting a report. I'll file a full debrief. I have evidence. The aircraft has damage that can't be explained by any known weapons system. My survival kit is full of things I made from materials that don't exist here. I have 3 years of entries in a journal I kept because I was terrified I'd forget what real looked like. But right now, all I can tell you is that I survived. I repaired the aircraft using whatever I could scavenge and fabricate, and when I found a way back, I took it. I pointed that A-10 toward where I thought home was, and I flew until either I got here or the aircraft came apart. Apparently, I got here. Harrow sat back in his chair, his mind racing. 3 years. She'd been missing for exactly 3 years, and now she was back with a story that sounded like fever dream or science fiction. But the aircraft was real. The damage was real. She was real, sitting in front of him with the eyes of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. The debrief will have to wait until you're medically cleared, he said finally. In the meantime, this conversation stays between us. Nobody else hears about valleys where the stars are wrong or physics that doesn't work right. Understood, she nodded, and he thought he saw relief in her expression. Maybe she'd expected him to have her committed. In the days that followed, Kasparov remained in the hospital while the base medical staff ran every test they could think of. Her physical injuries were real and documented. The healed fractures, the burned scars, the chronic malnutrition that spoke of months spent surviving on inadequate food. But her mental state was harder to quantify. The base psychologist, Major Chen, sat with her for hours, taking notes, asking careful questions. "Tell me about the first night," Chen said during their third session, his recorder running. "After you realized you weren't in Afghanistan anymore." Kasparov stared out the window at the mountains. "I thought I was dead, that's the honest answer. I thought I'd died in the crash and this was some kind of limbo or purgatory. The silence was what got to me first. No birds, no insects, no wind, just this absolute quiet that made my ears ring. I kept my sidearm in my hand all night because the quiet felt predatory somehow, like something was waiting in it." "Did something attack you that night?" "No, nothing happened. I waited in the cockpit until sunrise, and when the light came it was wrong, tinted slightly purple like looking through polarized glass. The sun rose in what should have been east, but my compass said it was rising in the west. That's when I knew for sure that something was fundamentally broken about where I was." Chen made a note. "How did you determine you were in a different place rather than disoriented?" She looked at him with something like pity. "Because I walked for 2 days trying to find any landmark I recognized, and I found a forest of trees that grew crystals instead of leaves. Because I found ruins of a structure that looked almost like a temple, but the architecture was all wrong, angles that hurt to look at. Because on the third day I saw something watching me from a ridge line, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen in any zoology textbook." Chen's pen had stopped moving. "What did it look like?" "Like a wolf, maybe, but twice the size and with too many legs and eyes that reflected light that wasn't there. I put a round from my M9 into the ground near it and it ran, and I heard it screaming as it went, except the sound came from the wrong direction, like the air was bent." The story that emerged over hours of careful debriefing was equal parts survival narrative and fever dream. Kasparov described a world that was almost Earth but fundamentally altered, as if someone had taken the rules of nature and adjusted them slightly in directions that made her pilot's training useless. Gravity was inconsistent. Objects fell at different rates depending on their color. Water flowed uphill in certain areas. The sun and moon moved in patterns that didn't match any astronomical model, and there were things living there, creatures and entities that seemed aware of her presence and curious about it in ways that raised the hair on the back of her neck. "I spent the first month just trying to stay alive," she told Chen. "The survival kit had maybe 2 weeks of food if I rationed carefully. I found water that seemed safe to drink, tested it with my chemical kit, boiled it, the whole process. I built a shelter near the aircraft because I still believed someone would find me. I kept my beacon running until the batteries died. Every day I expected to hear helicopters or see search planes, and every night I went to sleep wondering if tomorrow would be the day I finally broke down. What kept you going? Chen asked quietly. She thought about that for a long time. Spite, mostly. I was so angry at the universe for putting me there that I refused to quit, and I had the aircraft. As long as I had Corvid 1, I had a mission. Get her airworthy again and get us both home. It gave me something to focus on besides the absolute weirdness of where I was. The aircraft had become her sanctuary and her project. She'd done the post-crash assessment carefully, methodically, using every bit of her maintenance training and a lot of improvisation. The nose gear was destroyed beyond repair. The port wing had sustained major structural damage, with the forward spar cracked and several ribs broken. The right engine was running rough, probably from ingesting debris during the crash. The hydraulic system had multiple leaks. The avionics were mostly dead, and she had no tools except what was in the aircraft's basic toolkit, designed for emergency repairs, not complete rebuilds. But she'd had time. 3 years was a lot of time, and Kasparov had discovered that she was more stubborn than the universe was cruel. She'd cannibalized parts from the broken nose gear to reinforce the wing spar. She'd used materials from her parachute and survival kit to patch hydraulic lines. She'd learned through trial and error which of the local materials could be shaped and used. There were crystal formations that could be heated and molded, plant fibers that were stronger than steel cable when properly processed, minerals that could be ground into compounds that worked as sealants. It was engineering by desperation, and it shouldn't have worked. I had to relearn basic mechanics, she explained to the maintenance team that interviewed her. Nothing behaved the way it should. Metal was brittle in places where it should be ductile. The crystal stuff, I call it vitral because it looks like glass. It could bear enormous loads but would shatter if you looked at it wrong. I failed about 100 times for every success. There are pieces of aircraft scattered around that valley from experiments that didn't work. Senior Master Sergeant Torres, the head of aircraft maintenance, studied the photographs of Corvid 1's wing attachment. Ma'am, with all respect, this shouldn't hold. These patches, these fasteners, none of this is rated for flight stress. The first time you pulled more than 2 gs, this should have torn apart. Kasparov smiled grimly. It did, twice. I crashed twice more trying to get her airborne. The second crash broke my arm in 3 places. I set it myself using splints made from vitral and plant fiber and a lot of screaming. After that, I was more careful with my test flights. You flew before you left. Torres looked horrified. Ma'am, without ground support, without a proper runway, without anyone to spot damage. Without a choice, Sergeant. I couldn't just walk out. The terrain was impossible and I didn't know which direction home was. My only option was to fix the aircraft and fly until I found something familiar. So yes, I tested her. Short hops at first, just to make sure the gear would hold and the wing wouldn't separate. Then longer flights, mapping the area, looking for landmarks or signs of civilization. What she'd found instead were more impossibilities. Ruins that suggested a civilization had once existed in this place, but the architecture was wrong, doorways too narrow, ceilings too low, stairs with risers at irregular heights. Abandoned settlements where buildings grew from the ground like stone trees. And everywhere that sense of being watched by intelligences that didn't think the way humans thought. I saw them a few times, she admitted to Chen. Never clearly. Always at a distance or in peripheral vision. They didn't want to confront me directly, but they were curious. I'd find things moved when I came back to camp. Once I found a small device placed near my shelter. It looked like a carved stone, but it hummed when I picked it up. I buried it away from the aircraft because I didn't know what it was for and I didn't want to risk it interfering with my repairs. You must have been terrified, Chen said. She shook her head. Terror is acute. What I felt was more like low-grade dread that never went away. I got used to it the way you get used to tinnitus. It was just always there, this background awareness that I was somewhere I didn't belong and something knew it. The breakthrough had come 14 months in. Kasparov had been exploring a ruin about 10 miles from her camp when she'd found something that looked like a map, etched into a wall. It wasn't like any cartography she'd learned, but there were patterns, symbols, relationships between marked points. And one of those points had glowed faintly when she'd touched it, and suddenly she'd understood, not consciously, but with the kind of deep intuition that pilots develop about their aircraft. The valley she'd crashed in was special. It was a weak point, a place where the boundaries between her world and this one grew thin. And if she could find the right conditions, the right alignment, the right moment, she might be able to force her way back through. "I don't know how I knew," she told Harrow later. "It was like the information was downloaded directly into my head. I understood that there were windows, times when the barrier was permeable, and if I could get airborne during one of those windows and fly in exactly the right direction, I might punch through." The obsession that followed nearly killed her. She'd thrown herself into repairing the aircraft with renewed fury, working 16-hour days, testing and retesting every system. The engines were the hardest part. She'd had to rebuild the damaged one almost from scratch, using improvised parts and materials that no engineer would approve. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd fired it up only to have it flame out or vibrate itself apart. But gradually, impossibly, the A-10 had come back to life. Not in airworthy condition by any regulation standard, but functional enough that she thought she might be able to coax it into the air and keep it there long enough to matter. The first real test flight had been 2 years and 8 months after the crash. She'd timed it for what she thought was a window period, based on patterns she'd observed in the sky's color and the behavior of the local physics. She performed a full pre-flight despite having no checklist and no ground crew, just her memory and her training. Then she'd climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and started the engines. The takeoff had been rough. The aircraft wanted to veer left because of the asymmetric drag from the damaged wing, and she'd had to hold right rudder all the way through the takeoff roll. The nose gear that she'd jury-rigged from scavenged parts had rattled ominously but held. And then she'd been airborne, climbing through air that felt slightly thicker than it should, and for the first time in years she'd felt something like hope. She'd flown a careful pattern around the valley, testing the aircraft's handling, learning its new quirks and limitations. It flew like a wounded bird, requiring constant attention and correction, but it flew. When she'd landed, she'd sat in the cockpit and cried for the first time since the crash. The actual escape had come 4 months later. She'd felt it coming. The air had tasted different, the light had taken on a particular quality, and the sense of wrongness that permeated everything had intensified. She'd loaded what few possessions she wanted to keep into the cockpit, performed one last pre-flight, and taken off with no plan except to fly until something changed or the aircraft fell apart. "I headed what I thought was east," she told the debrief team. "I climbed to 10,000 feet, which was about as high as I trusted the patched wing to handle, and I just flew. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then the air started to feel normal again. The controls started responding the way they were supposed to. I looked back and the valley was gone, just vanished behind me like it had never existed. And ahead of me I saw mountains I recognized. The Hindu Kush. I knew exactly where I was." The navigation had still been challenging. Without functioning GPS or radios, she'd been flying on visual references and dead reckoning. But these were skills she'd learned in flight school and honed through hundreds of hours in the cockpit. She'd picked up the road network, followed it north, and when she'd recognized the Bagram Valley, she'd almost wept again. "I should have called in sooner," she admitted. "But the radios were barely functional, and I was afraid if I transmitted too early, you'd scramble fighters to intercept me, and they'd see the state of the aircraft and think I was hostile or compromised. I waited until I was close enough that I could make emergency approach if you denied me landing clearance." "We wouldn't have denied you," Harrow said. "I would have landed on taxiway if you had. I was putting that airplane on the ground at Bagram one way or another, sir." I'd come too far to turn back. The story spread despite Harrow's attempts to contain it, because too many people had seen the aircraft and heard the radio calls and witnessed the landing. Within a week, Everyone at Bagram knew that Captain Kasparov had returned from the dead flying an A-10 held together by impossible materials and miracles. The reactions varied. Some people thought she was lying, that she'd been captured and escaped and was covering it up with a fantastic story. Others thought she'd gone crazy from isolation and stress. But the maintenance crews who examined the aircraft knew the truth was stranger than either explanation, because the repairs to Corvid 1 defied everything they knew about materials science and structural engineering. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, one of the Air Force's top accident investigators, arrived at Bagram 5 days after Kasparov's return and spent a week examining the aircraft. Her report was classified, but the summary leaked eventually. The modifications to aircraft 810964 incorporate materials and techniques unknown to current aerospace engineering. Samples have been retained for analysis. The pilot's account of the aircraft's flight characteristics is consistent with the observed damage patterns. No evidence of deception has been found. Recommend full medical and psychological evaluation of pilot and further investigation of claimed crash site when security conditions permit. Chen interviewed Kasparov personally, sitting in the same hospital room where the pilot was slowly regaining weight and strength. "The materials are the part that bothers me most," Chen admitted. "I've sent samples to 3 different labs and they all say the same thing: unknown crystalline structures, metallic properties that don't match any known alloy organic compounds that have no business being load-bearing. Where did this stuff come from? I told you where it came from. You just don't want to believe it. It's not that I don't want to believe it. It's that I'm a scientist and I need explanations that fit within the laws of physics as we understand them." Kasparov laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Colonel, I flew through a place where physics didn't work right. I lived there for 3 years. I learned to work within rules that made no sense but were consistent enough that I could exploit them. And I brought back proof in the form of an aircraft that shouldn't be able to fly but does. If your laws of physics can't account for that, maybe your laws are incomplete." Chen had no answer to that. She filed her report, noted the anomalies, and recommended ongoing study. Then she did something unusual. She recommended Kasparov for the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism, citing her survival, her improvised repairs, and her successful return flight as evidence of skill and determination beyond the call of duty. The recommendation made its way up the chain of command and landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Patricia Hammond, commander of Air Combat Command, who read it 3 times and then called Harrow personally. "Marcus, I need you to tell me if this pilot is credible or if we're dealing with a psychological breakdown with some very creative confabulation." Harrow, who'd spent 2 weeks watching Kasparov navigate medical exams and debriefs with patience and consistency, didn't hesitate. "She's credible, ma'am. I don't understand what happened to her, but I believe she's telling the truth as she experienced it. And the aircraft. You need to see it yourself to understand why this isn't just a story about survival. This is something else entirely." Hammond flew to Bagram the following week and spent an hour in the hangar where Corvid 1 had been secured. She walked around the aircraft slowly, examining the repairs, touching the strange materials carefully. She'd been a fighter pilot herself once, had logged thousands of hours in F-16s, knew intimately what aircraft should and shouldn't be able to do. What she saw before her violated every principle of that knowledge. "Get me the pilot," she said finally. They met in Harrow's office: Hammond, Harrow, Kasparov, and Chen. Kasparov had been released from the hospital 2 days earlier, still underweight but declared fit for duty. She stood at attention when Hammond entered, her uniform crisp, her bearing military correct despite everything she'd been through. "Captain Kasparov," Hammond said, "I've read your debrief, all 47 pages of it. I've examined your aircraft. I've reviewed the medical reports and the psychological evaluations. I've consulted with some of the smartest people in the Air Force, and none of them can explain what I'm looking at. So I'm going to ask you directly, is there any part of your account that you're uncertain about? Any details that might have been imagined or misremembered?" Kasparov met her eyes steadily. "No, ma'am. I wish there were. I wish I could tell you I had a head injury and hallucinated the whole thing and actually spent 3 years in a cave surviving on insects and groundwater. That would be easier to accept. But I know what I saw and where I was and what I did to survive it. Hammond nodded slowly. The Air Force has a problem, Captain. We have an aircraft that shouldn't exist, incorporating technologies we can't replicate or even fully understand. We have a pilot who's been declared KIA and had a memorial service, whose parents buried an empty coffin. We have a story that, if it became public, would make us look either incompetent or insane. And we have about 100 people on this base who know pieces of it and are going to talk eventually. She paused. We need a narrative, something that explains your return without mentioning impossible valleys or physics that don't work right. Something that lets you keep your wings and your career without making the Air Force look like it's endorsing science fiction. With respect, ma'am, the truth is already out there. You can't put it back in the box. No, but we can contextualize it. We can call it classified, ongoing investigation. Details cannot be revealed for security reasons. We can focus on the survival and the repairs and the heroic return flight without dwelling on the where and the what. We can give people enough to be satisfied without giving them everything. Kasparov felt something cold in her chest. You want me to lie, ma'am? I want you to be strategic about what you share. There's a difference. Hammond's voice softened. Captain, I believe you. I don't understand what happened, but I believe you experienced something extraordinary. And because I believe you, I want to protect you from what will happen if this story gets out uncontrolled. You'll be labeled crazy. You'll be the subject of conspiracy theories. Your career will be over and you'll spend the rest of your life being interviewed by people who think you're either lying or delusional. Is that what you want? The answer, when it came, surprised everyone, including Kasparov herself. I want to fly, ma'am. That's all I've ever wanted. If staying quiet about the details means I can keep doing that, then I'll stay quiet. But the aircraft is evidence. The materials are real. Someone should be studying what I brought back, because if I could stumble into that place, other people might too. And they might not be as lucky as I was. Hammond glanced at Chen, who nodded. We're already studying it, quietly, with people who have the clearances and the expertise. What you brought back could revolutionize materials science if we can figure out how to synthesize it. But that's going to take years, maybe decades. In the meantime, you need to go back to being a regular pilot with an extraordinary survival story that has some classified elements we can't discuss. The narrative that emerged was carefully crafted. Captain Nadia Kasparov had survived a crash in remote terrain, had evaded enemy forces while repairing her aircraft using improvised materials, and had successfully returned to friendly air